Hi everyone, my warmest felicitations. It's great to be with you. Before we set off together, exploring more memories, thoughts of ghosts that still surround us and affect us to this day, please indulge me while I remind you to check out my patreon.com site. I know that so many of you are already there, already making the contribution that matters, but I must invite as many as possible to do likewise. It's by signing up and joining my patreon.com site that you most practically support what we try to do here. When you become a member, now it costs about the price of a cup of coffee, about £5 a month. You can join for a whole year, which is cheaper. It's cheaper by the dozen, or you can pay monthly. All are welcome. You get early access to all my new content. You get exclusive access to a question and answer session, which we love, and other things besides. It's a great site, I think. We try to make it better all the time. So help by joining up and adding yourself to the mix, for that will surely enhance the whole experience. Okay, it's now time to contemplate the presence of another ghost. The destination for this episode is, well, it's a house called the Old Vicarage in Grantchester, in England, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The Old Vicarage in Grantchester, when last I looked, was owned by Geoffrey Archer and his family. But it's the hub, I suppose, around which I'd like to contemplate the Great War, the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, with specific reference to Rupert Brooke, the embodiment of gilded youth, described by William Butler Yeats as the handsomest man in England. And he seems to me to epitomise the way in which we're invited to think about at least some of the young men who were swept up into the maelstrom of the First World War. And there's a great tragedy in it, and it's nothing less than haunting. For those of us of a certain inclination, thoughts of the First World War, they come at us unexpectedly, but at all times. I'm never far from a thought about the Great War. All sorts of things make my mind drift in that direction. And I make no bones about it. I've written about the Great War, not as any kind of serious historian, but because it's a preoccupation for me, because my grandfathers fought in and survived the First World War. Because of that, I feel connected to it. And I simply have long regarded it as the most significant historical event. Full stop. It's hard. It's always hard to get at figures. I've said this over and over again. When you contemplate death tolls from this battle and that war and all of the rest of it, and the number of people involved in this, that, and the next thing, numbers are always spun. I don't really trust any numbers, not 100%. There's an agenda underpinning the way in which numbers are applied to events. In the case of World War I, the numbers, I think it's fair to say, have sort of cycled upwards since 1918, 1919. With every passing decade, it seems to suggest that maybe more people died. The number gets bigger. But that's true of numbers relating to a lot of historical events. In the case of the First World War, you'll get a figure of 20 million as a round number. Casualties, death. It's a staggering number. When you contemplate what the world's population was 100 more years ago when the First World War actually took place. It's a significantly smaller population from which to harvest 20 million men. But I don't mean this to sound the way it might. The actual number, I don't think as important as the realisation that something else died, something older, something that mattered more died between 1914 and 1918. It's been said often, it's not my words, it's another thought, that a set of iron railings is set between all that went before and everything that's happened since. And that set of iron railings is the First World War. It's a perfect image because, rather than a brick wall, the idea of a set of tall railings means that you can see through to the world of before, but you can't touch it. You can't go back, but we can see what was there. So that the past is visible, but forever out of reach. And I would say that what died between 1914 and 1918 still haunts us now. That ghost, whatever it was that died between those years, is still with us, an unquiet ghost. And I would say as well that the pains around the world, the great sort of geopolitical tensions, even now, are still the consequence of wounds that were inflicted then. Something fundamental happened. Something fundamental shifted between 1914 and 1918. It changed the world in a way that I would say that nothing else has changed it since, not even World War II. It's my opinion. I said before, my grandfather survived it. I think about that often. It's almost an obsession. My dad's dad was Robert Miller Oliver, and my mum's dad was James Cameron Neil. I am Neil Oliver because it remembers my mum's maiden name, James Cameron Neil, and both were hurt, significantly. I think that's really what does it for me. Both bore wounds for the rest of their lives. My dad's dad was hurt by at least one explosion. It's also vague. We never really got a chapter and verse account of exactly what had happened because neither man came back and said very much about it. So there's a lot of vagueness about it. But my dad's dad was hurt in at least one explosion, possibly on the Menin Road, the road to Menin, and it sent him home for a while. He had to be sent home to get repaired and to convalesce. But he had shell fragments in his head and wounds elsewhere in his body ever after. And my mum's dad, James Cameron Neil, he was shot by friendly fire in Gallipoli. A sentry in the camp that he was returning to with other men was apparently drunk and opened fire on them, mistaking them for enemy soldiers. And the other two men were killed, but my mum's dad was shot through, leaving damage that shortened his life. He didn't make it out of his 50s, my mum's dad. And he was only young. He'd lied about his age. He'd got into it all before he was 18. So he was still in his teens when he was invalided out of the war and back home and took no further part in it. But I've been haunted by the thought that if either incident had worked out slightly differently, I wouldn't be here because both men were hurt long before I was a twinkle in anybody's eye. And I think often about the fact that if that tumbling bullet had taken a different path through James, or if Robert had been any closer to the blast, they would have either or both would have ceased to be before I ever had a chance of being. And I think that's really at the root of why it haunts me. I think about it often. William Faulkner said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And I sort of carry bits of it. On here last week, I showed my Robert Miller Oliver's wristwatch that he was presented with when he finally retired from his job in a supermarket in 1954. So that sits there as a permanent reminder to me. So anyway, I think anyone thinking that the Great War, the First World War, is past, that it's behind us, that it can be forgotten, is mistaken. I say that we're the damaged descendants of damaged ancestors, the damaged children of damaged parents, grandparents, and great grandparents. And if you read about the war the way I do, which is not really in terms of serious history, I've never really been particularly fascinated or preoccupied by the statistics and the tactics and the attempts that uncountable numbers of people have made to explain exactly how it happened. It's really more about the impact that it had. So I tend to read about. I read those people who have contemplated what it did to those that were there, and and the rippling aftermath thereafter. And if you read those kind of books, and if you read the kind of accounts that I'm interested in, you eventually stumble across mention of Rupert Brooke, poet. He's the embodiment of what was held up as the brightest flower of English manhood that gave itself for freedom. And it's kind of calculated, I think. It's part of the building of the load-bearing myth that is the way we're invited to think about the First World War. Rupert Brooke typifies, exemplifies a kind of figure that we are encouraged to think about in relation to the generation that was lost, was thrown away, actually. And Brooke is a kind of a golden thread shining out of the tapestry, carefully woven. That's the way we're invited to picture events. I've already in this series talked about the emotional residue, which is this idea that where something of great significance happens in a place, that some residue of the resultant emotions hangs in the air like perfume or smoke, and that many, many years later, somebody else, other people, might encounter it, might get a sense of it, and that it's part of what it is to be haunted. And Brooke is a particularly good invitation to think in that way, because he himself actually wrote about his own essence. He predicted that his mortal remains would be transformative wherever they ended up. You know, he was one of these. He was obviously one of these guys that, you know, had that idea of a rendezvous with death. You know, that idea, going off into the war, the imagined dying, and he had thought it through and imagined that wherever his body was buried, it would change that place. In the fifth of his war sonnets, for which he became famous, he wrote, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore." So it's part of why he's remembered the way that he is. I think that idea of a dust concealed, something that would enrich anything that it touched. It's not vainglorious. It's just a product of the way that he was invited to think of what it was to be an Englishman. The other day, funnily enough, I was reading a bit of Lord of the Rings, which I often read, and when the Fellowship of the Ring, the hobbits and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and the rest encounter the Lady Galadriel, the kind of elven queen, she gives each of them a gift, and to one of the hobbits, Samwise, she gives a box of earth from her own orchard. And she tells them that if she takes, it's dust really, she tells them that if he takes it back to the Shire and sprinkles it around the place, that it will transform the Shire. Other things will grow and it will become fruitful and fertile in a way that it would never have been but for the dust that she invites him to carry away with him. And it's that same idea. And actually, Tolkien fought in and survived the First World War, and it's supposed that he based the idea of Samwise Gamgee on his Batman. Tolkien was an officer. He had a junior soldier that kind of looked after his, you know, whatever that served him. And so it's got that connotation about it of the embodiment of another kind of Englishman, you know, that enriching. In fact, I mean, to get back to Rupert Brooke, he died at sea. Ironically, having predicted the way that he thought he would die, he died at sea, and it was an inglorious end. There's no denying it. He was on his way to the landings at Gallipoli. He left England with the British Expeditionary Force, February 28th, 1915, and that makes me connect him with my maternal grandfather. You know, I've wondered, I mean, because his account of what happened to him is so incomplete. I don't know when my grandfather departed for Gallipoli, but I've wondered if he was there or thereabouts when making his way out, being transported out to Gallipoli around the same time as Rupert Brooke. don't know, never will. In actual fact, Rupert Brooke took ill with sunstroke and dysentery at Port Said in Egypt. And the truth of the matter was, although he was a beautiful young man and great at sport and academically gifted and all of the rest of it, he had a weak constitution. His immune system was less than robust. And while he was laid low with sunstroke and dysentery, it would appear that he got a mosquito bite on his lip, and it became infected, and it led to sepsis. He was so run down, he probably never ought to have left Egypt. Really, the army ought to have left him behind. But nonetheless, out he went, ill as he was, and before he got to Gallipoli, he was on a French hospital ship, and it was anchored as part of the flotilla, moving out towards Gallipoli, and it was sheltered in a bay off the coast of one of the Greek islands, Skiros, when his condition took the final turn for the worse. And he died of sepsis, blood poisoning, sometime late in the afternoon of February the 23rd, which is St. George's Day and the birthday of Shakespeare. So, part of the legend, he's so English that he dies on the day of the patron saint and the day of the birth of the bard. And they couldn't wait. There was nothing they could do, really, so he was quite hurriedly buried in the evening of the same day in a grove of olive trees on Skiros, at a site about a mile from the coast, a mile from Homer's wine-dark sea. Brooke had been born into a life of kind of gentle privilege. He was of the upper class. His father was William, who was a housemaster at Rugby School in Warwickshire, and his mother was Ruth, who was a matron at the school. He was taught, his early education was at home by a tutor, and then at Hillbrow Prep School, and then at Rugby, his father's school, where he excelled academically and at sport, and particularly rugby, the ball game that's named after the school. But always his health bedevilled him, really. 1904, he had some sort of bout of illness in his youth, and when he recovered, or as part of his recovery, he was sent away to a family friends in Genoa to recuperate for some months in their villa. That's the kind of life that he came from. He'd been unwell, and so he was, parcelled off to a warmer clime to get his strength back. And while he was lolling about, he wrote, including poetry, mostly poetry, for which he had already demonstrated some sort of aptitude. It was all his time at school, and when he finally got back, he won a scholarship to Cambridge, where he read classics and English lit. And when he was first up at Cambridge, he was in college rooms, the kind of halls of residence equivalent, whatever. But he did that for a year and then left for digs in Grantchester, which is a fairly leafy, dreamy little village. It certainly was then, a few miles up the River Cam from Cambridge. This is the Orchard Tea Rooms, which was owned by the Stevenson family. And he was he seems to have been in himself, and possibly on account of the influence of the people that he began to attract and moved among. You call it louche company. A cast of characters, including Virginia Woolf, and a lot of them wafting about the place, described themselves as neo-pagans. They were getting back to kind of nature, back to an earlier version of religion. They walked about barefoot. Can you imagine what it must have been like for the kind of working people of Grantchester, these leafy aristos wafting about the place? They swam naked in the river, and they sat about long into the night, reciting poetry to one another. And socialist politics were a big part of their thinking at that time, in the early part of the first decade of the 20th century. And his father, Rupert's father, died in 1910. And there or thereabouts, he took ill again. He's kind of physically a bit frail, or it might be emotionally. Either way, things got on top of him, either physically or mentally. But he had a bit of a bout of illness. And when he recovered, by the time he was better, the Stevenson family that owned the Orchard Tea Rooms, above which he had rooms, they kind of had a word in his ear and said that all these barefoot Bohemians floating about were less than desirable as far as they were concerned. So they chased them. And so at that point, Brooke took up residence in the Old Vicarage in Grantchester, which is the house that I mentioned at the top. So there he is in his pomp, in his prime, I suppose. W.B. Yeats calls him the most handsome young man in England. He's charismatic. He attracts all sorts of people, men and women. He seemed to go from one intense pash, a crush relationship, to another. Whether any or all of them were consummated is left a bit vague. And at Cambridge, during those years at university, he was friends with a whole cast of memorable people: E.M. Forster, Bertrand Russell, Lytton and James Strachey, Maynard Keynes, others besides. He was counted in amongst the Bloomsbury group, which is famous amongst those that are interested in English literature. They said that they lived in squares and loved in triangles. He met Henry James. He was friends with Winston Churchill also. So he's right up there in the echelons of British society. But always his love life and whatever his passions and his uncertainties about who and what he was, they repeatedly got the better of him. So he had another breakdown, he had a breakdown in about 1911. And in the aftermath of that, he left England and travelled. One of the publications resultant from it, for time in Germany, was Homesick in Berlin, which he wrote in 1912. And one of the poems was the Old Vicarage, Grantchester. Quote, "And laughs the immortal river still, under the mill, stands the church clock at 10 to 3, and is there honey still for tea?" Hard to read this stuff. It's from a time that was obliterated, I would say, that was obliterated by the First World War, along with much else. That kind of unbearably trusting naivety evidenced by the likes of Rupert Brooke. It's even hard to take it seriously, and is there honey still for tea? When you know what's coming next, this is 1912, when you know what's coming, that this gilded young man was thinking and writing in that way. In any event, it's a paean to England. Not Britain, England specifically. And a version of England that only ever existed for a hallowed few anyway. And to whomever it belonged, it was about to disappear for everyone and forever. After Europe, he was in the USA. Then he was in the South Pacific, specifically Tahiti. And there he met and fell in love with a local woman. And he by the time he left, that woman was pregnant. In any event, however much he was aware of, he never knew and never met the daughter that resulted. Hasten hand in human hand down the dark, the flowered way, and in the water's soft caress. So if that was a time of happiness for him, if uncomplicated happiness was ever available to Brooke, he returned to England from there. And within months of his return, war was declared. And he immediately, as so much of his generation, as so much of his class, he sought and was awarded a commission in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, as it turned out. But he just wanted to be part of it, as so many of them did, God bless them. His part of the Naval Reserve was posted to Antwerp in Belgium. And it was there that he composed the work for which he is best known. Because it's a short life. He didn't have time to create a great canon of work. But what he wrote in that time in Belgium was 5 sonnets called 1914. So the war is there, and he's writing, reflecting already. And it's the epitome of what was going to die in the war. more of what was about to die in the war, alongside all those men and boys. The first of the sonnets is called Peace, and in which Brooke actually imagines war as a relief for young men like him, for whom life had grown wearisome and kind of grey, because life wasn't challenging them. They'd had it too easy, I suppose, and everything was, is there honey still for tea? And it lacked meaning. Going into his young adulthood, what was the point? And in that context, the advent of a world war seemed exciting. He wrote, "God be thanked who has matched us with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye and sharpened power, to turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary." So that sense of, oh, thank goodness, a war. It's impossible now to imagine, I think, anyone, any generation, ever again thinking, great, the chance of a world war. Apart from the odd person that's drawn to be a professional soldier, for the mass of the rank and file, I don't think that emotion would ever come again. There's almost an appetite for death. I came across, when I was thinking about this again, I came across a poem written in 1917 by Alan Seeger. "I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair." It's there too. Seeger's work is a bit darker than anything that Brooke wrote, but then again, it was written in 1917 when so much of what was to happen had happened, so much of what was to happen that Brooke never saw. And it's because Brooke remains on the other side of the railings. He's always in the past. He's not really touched significantly, meaningfully, properly by the First World War. Although he was there until 1915, he's still on the other side of the railings, before the horror. And so it's always, you've got to bear that in mind, however cynical you might be about the kind of poetry that he was writing and the way that he was, like swimmers into cleanness leaping. He was born in privilege, and he had the life that he had, and we shouldn't and can't really judge him. But his words are hard to read. That's all there is to it. There's an irony about them, because we know what was to come, what was to happen next, that he didn't. He thought he knew. And his sentiments are unbearable, given all that was to come. I mean, there was nothing clean about what lay ahead for millions of men and boys. There's nothing clean. It was the antithesis of clean. But 1914, that collection of sonnets, it made him famous while he was still alive. In the fourth of them, he described death as an infinite frost, a frost for all time that leaves, quote, "a white unbroken glory, a gathered radiance." He was maintaining that idea that in death there was some sort of pristine perfection, as though those who would die in the war to come would be preserved as they had been in life, like shining marble statues of themselves. Far less the crushed reality of men's bodies tattered into fragments or transformed into pink mist. He was preoccupied with, a pristine perfection to be obtained by dying young and beautiful. And to be fair to him, his death, I suppose, had something of a Homeric quality about it. But for the fact that he died of blood poisoning, but he was this beautiful young man, and he was taken in his prime, as though the gods had come to reclaim what they had bestowed upon him. Those whom the gods would destroy and all that. And he was buried by moonlight. The burial party that took his body ashore, the moon was up, and they fired a volley of shots over his grave, and they left behind a wooden cross To some extent for Brooke, his own premonition was made real. A silvered eternity of peace, silver moonlight on his cross, on his grave. And Winston Churchill, who was certainly an acquaintance, if not a friend, he sensed the power. Churchill was a writer, in his own right, and obviously skilled at spinning and giving people a sense of what he thought they ought to think. And he sensed latent power in Rupert Brooke's fall when he did. And he contributed to the obituary that was published in the Times for Brooke on the 26th of April 1915. He wrote Churchill's part of it, or part of Churchill's part of the obituary reads, "This life has closed at the moment when it seemed to have reached its springtime. A voice had become audible, a note had been struck, more true, more thrilling, more able to do justice to the nobility of our youth in arms, engaged in this present war, than any other more able to express their thoughts of self-surrender. Joyous, fearless, versatile, deeply instructed, with classic symmetry of mind and body, ruled by high, undoubting purpose, he was all that one would wish England's noblest sons to be in the days when no sacrifice but the most precious is acceptable, and the most precious is that which is most freely proffered." I mean, there's by now there's something almost obscene about that sentiment. When no sacrifice but the most precious is acceptable. That thinking that if you're going to prosecute a cause, if you're going to fight a world war, that you want your most perfect sons to be consumed by it. I can't imagine anyone ever thinking like that about their son, but there you go. Many did, and maybe some still do. And this is the haunting, this is the ghost. That spirit, or it's part of it, that something was conjured that gulled a generation into the meat grinder. Something was summoned, a Pied Piper, that the millions followed into destruction. Obviously other men, countless other men and boys and women died in other wars since, but the innocence of people like Rupert Brooke that thought that they had been awoken by God, the Christian God, to leap as swimmers into cleanness, I don't think that thought would not survive. That died between 1914 and 1918. And so also we are haunted then by the shade, the ghost, the spirit of their innocence. That betrayed innocence. The world that they were robbed of in their quiet paradise. That's there too. Haunts me every time I pass a war memorial. I mean, in the aftermath of the First World War, there was the huge outpouring of public grief because the people had no graves to visit in the main. The British Army buried the dead where they fell. And in 1918 and the years thereafter, for most people, going to visit the graves was out of reach. And so people wanted something where they lived. So they commissioned and paid for themselves. This wasn't a government exercise. Communities, villages, societies, factories, whatever, paid for artists to create these war memorials. Every single one of them. There's about 40,000 of them dotted about. They're a manifestation of what the First World War meant, that people needed somewhere to take that impossible cargo of grief. And so every time I pass one of these war memorials, especially if I'm in a new town, I look for names. I look for Oliver. I just do. They're always alphabetised, and I look to see if anybody that might be a distant relation of mine is there on them. But we're also haunted by the ghost of the poet that Rupert Brooke might have become if he had lived. He died on the other side of the railings. He died in the gilded past. He died in that innocent Edwardian world that most could not see what the future held. And you get a glimpse of the fact that he may have been in the process of growing up, because he left behind a notebook that where he was making notes on the ship on the way out. And one of them is he spends an evening. He's looking through windows from wherever he is. He can see some men on the other side of it, and he just watches them. And he writes, "Pride in their strength and in the weight and firmness and linked beauty of bodies and pity. This gay machine of splendour soon to be broken, thought little of, pashed, scattered like coloured shadows thinner than filmy glass, perishing things and strange ghosts soon to die. To other ghosts, this one or that or I." So maybe he's already listening to what others are saying, people coming from other experience, maybe people who see or give him an alternative hint of the ugly reality of what might lie ahead. That his own innocence was mortal. It may have been dying on board that ship. It may have been passing into something else that never came to full fruition. Already by April 15, he had watched the sacking of Antwerp. He had watched Antwerp had fallen and people were driven from it, refugees. I mean, it was pretty bloodless, and people were just chased out. But at the very least, it meant that he witnessed people driven away from their stolen lives. Carrying whatever they could. These sad parades of people chased from their homes. Pushing wheelbarrows or horse and cart with a few belongings. But we certainly can't blame him. I don't mean at all to blame him for not reflecting on what he didn't live to see. He didn't see Flanders. He didn't see the Somme. He didn't see Passchendaele and Arras and the rest of the charnel houses. Because if he had seen the Western Front, he would, in all likelihood, have acquired the irony that suffuses Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and others who lived long enough to have their innocence flayed from them like living skin. Gilded youth Rupert Brooke was and remained on account of his death when he died, but others who lived to tell the tale were old before their time. Gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. That's death by poison gas. After Brooke's swimmers into cleanness leaping, Owen, for those were Wilfred Owen's words, what he saw changed him. And there's a book, The Great War in Modern Memory, by Paul Fussell, who's an American veteran of the First World War and an author. And he talked about how people like Owen saw the transformation of swimmers into cleanness leaping that Brooke contemplated into the mud flounderers of the Somme and Passchendaele sinking beneath the surface. Men just dying by their thousands in the mud, never to be seen again. Whatever else Brooke was, golden boy, flawed human being, combination of both, the world he professed to know was immortalised by him. And as he died, that Elysium died with him. That heaven, that lost heaven died with him. I mentioned at the top, the Old Vicarage, it was acquired in 1979 by Lord Geoffrey Archer and his wife Mary. It's an elegant building. It's very pretty. Imposing gates around the garden. But long before the Archers acquired the place, there were already reports of ghosts. People reported experiences that they put down to an encounter with the ghost of Rupert Brooke. He's glimpsed walking in the garden. There's reports of books and ornaments seen to move on shelves within the building. People see something out the corner of their eye. Other people, visitors, residents, tenants, they talk about hearing footsteps someone walking around the house who never comes, who never arrives. They hear footsteps in the hall outside the sitting room on the ground floor. And sometimes, as well as sounds, there's sights of a figure in the house, in the garden. There's similar in the orchardteriums, actually. People say that they've seen Rupert Brooke's ghost in the orchardteriums, that first address that he had in the village. And I think significantly, in many ways, on the Cam is a pool called Byron's Pool, which is where Byron, who is regarded by many as Brooke's sort of poet predecessor, he swam in this pool. And people claim to see Byron's ghost there, swimming naked in the water, pale as a fish. And Byron was another who had this kind of gilded beauty. And they're bound by destiny, actually. They're bound by fate. Brooke died on the way to Gallipoli. Byron swam the narrows of the Hellespont, Gallipoli, in 1810, 100 years before Brooke. They both died in Greece in April, in a time of war. Byron died in April 1824, fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Greek War of Independence. So they have this strange connection across time. But for me, for many, for millions, forever, the First World War is timeless and endless. I've always said it's too big. You can't contemplate the enormity of the First World War. That's why when I've ever written about it, I've always written about it in relation to individuals, like my own relations, and it's the only way I can make sense of it. You go now, the corners of foreign fields, you find yourself in the awful cemeteries of Flanders. They're terrible, really. Tyne-Cot and the rest of them. They're beautifully maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They look amazing. The Portland stone crosses and gravestones, the close cropped grass, the order, the optical illusion of order that was created. I mean, these were rows of crosses and gravestones erected over mass graves afterwards, to create a semblance of serried ranks of men. And they're picturesque and photogenic, but they're terrible. You're standing over the graves of thousands of men. And then back in London, there's the cenotaph in Whitehall. Cenotaph was designed by the architect Edwin Lutyens. There's the grave of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, buried among kings. So when you go look at, if you go looking for the First World War and the ghosts of the First World War, you can visit those places. You can go to those cemeteries. You can go to the cenotaph. You can go to the grave of the unknown warrior. You can also go to the Old Vicarage in Grantchester in search of Brooke, or you can go to Byron's Pool. What I'm talking about is the power of myth. That's what we're given from the past. We're told, because there's a national amnesia. There's an amnesia, a forgetfulness about our species. We don't remember. There's a fatigue about it. It takes too much effort to remember something so terrible as the First World War. And so what we're handed is a myth. It's packaged up for us, and we're told how to think about it and how to remember it. It's a load-bearing myth, and it's heresy to question that way in which we're invited to think about the First World War. I don't question for a moment the sincerity or the sacrifice of those millions who died. I mean, what else could they do after all? Almost without exception, they were powerless in the face of the events into which they were swept up. It's not about that. But as more and more of the years have gone by, I've questioned more and more what actually happened, how it came to pass. I said at the top that I haven't, for the longest time, I didn't really spend much time thinking why the First World War happened. And I didn't think too much about the set-piece battles and, why events unfolded the way they did and why the decisions were made. It's always been about the impact for me, what it did to individuals. But relatively recently, I've contemplated other speculations about how it all happened. if you read into the First World War, you'll come across those that speculate that in the years, in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century, there grew a secretive group, a secretive elite that championed the British Empire and that wanted to see the British Empire survive forever, and they wanted its dominance to grow and never to be challenged. And as the 19th century wore out and the 20th century came on, there were those that could see threats to the hegemony of the British Empire and began to take steps to counter the threat. And, there's a whole cast of characters, but a lot of the time this idea of a cabal, a secret elite, seems to circulate around Cecil Rhodes, who'd made unimaginable millions from diamond mining in South Africa and was dedicated the idea of his, because he knew he was going to die. He had a heart condition and he knew he wasn't going to see old age, and he committed his wealth to perpetuating something. And if Cecil Rhodes is often portrayed as a pivotal point of this secretive group, there's others that, a lot of them they were all men of wealth, men of high birth, men of privilege. A lot of them were influenced by a professor of fine arts at Oxford University, John Ruskin, who had very strong ideas about the innate superiority of the English ruling class, and that the world would always be a better place if it was always ruled by the English. The names within this group, Natty Rothschild, that's Nathaniel Rothschild, Earl Grey, Alfred Bate, Leander Starr Jameson, Alfred Milner. You always run across him. He was a colonial administrator, a civil servant, very clever, very academic, very controlling. It was William Stead, who's an influential journalist, a populist journalist. The aristos, Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil, who's Lord Salisbury. He dominated the Conservative Party. The Liberal Party was dominated by Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl Rosebery. Lord Esher, who was an advisor to 2 or 3 different monarchs. So it was a clique. The component parts, they vary, but there seemed to be a clique. It connected England to the United States of America, and they may have in part had in mind the outbreak of World War I, with a view to, breaking Germany, that was an emergent European power at the time and posed a threat to English hegemony. But in any event, it was a clique that had plans on laying the foundations for something permanent, something that would permanently control the destiny of the world. And I just read about it. I don't know. I read about it more and more, but the consequence was that all those honourable men and boys, all those millions and their families, trusting and then betrayed by the reality of the First World War, they're trapped as though in amber. And the amber is the myth that we see engraved in the war memorials, the greater glory of God, freedom. That's what's handed down to us. That's why we are told the First World War happened. But as the years go on and I become more and more cynical about more and more things, I question it all. And I just know that I'm always haunted by something that may not as yet have been properly contemplated. That there's a truth about how and why the First World War happened. And it's there as a ghost, or it's there banging its fists on the outside of the glass, and it's not been properly heard yet. The truth about what led to the harvesting, the slaughter of millions of men and boys is a spirit, a shade, a ghost out there waiting to be seen and heard. That's what I think. In the grey tumult of these after years, oft silence falls, and less than echoes of remembered tears. Hush all the loud confusion of the heart. So a poor ghost beside his misty streams is haunted by strange doubts, evasive dreams, and light on weaving grass he knows not when, and feet that ran but where he cannot tell.